The remote cabin in Montana's Glacier National Park had been Fem's sanctuary for 6 months, far from the government lab, far from the questions, far from the classified research that had cost her everything. 8 months pregnant and alone except for Leo, her German shepherd, she thought she'd finally found peace. Then she discovered the eggs, 3 of them, nestled in her woodshed like oversized pearls, pulsing with an inner light that made her skin crawl. Leo had been going crazy for days, barking and whining at the shed, his hackles raised in primal fear. Fem knew she should destroy them immediately. As a former xenobiologist for a Black Ops division, she recognized the signs of extraterrestrial incubation. But something stopped her, a maternal instinct that whispered these eggs were somehow connected to the life growing inside her. When the first crack appeared across the largest egg surface, she realized her past had finally caught up with her, and the secret experiments she'd fled might have changed her baby in ways she never imagined. What had they really done to her during those final months at the lab? Leo's warning bark echoed through the crisp mountain air, more urgent now than ever before. Fem pressed her palm against her swollen belly, feeling the baby respond to her elevated heart rate with restless kicks. The life inside her seemed to pulse in rhythm with the egg's strange luminescence, a synchronicity that made her mouth go dry. She stepped closer to the shed, ignoring Leo's attempts to block her path. The German shepherd planted himself between her and the wooden structure, his brown eyes pleading. But Fem couldn't resist the pull she felt toward those impossible objects. Her scientific training warred with something deeper, more primal. The largest egg, roughly the size of a football, sat slightly apart from the others. Its surface was smooth and opalescent, shifting between deep purple and silver as the light caught it. The crack that had appeared ran from top to bottom now, a jagged line that seemed to breathe. Something moved within. Fem's memories flashed back to her final day at the Kepler Institute. Dr. Martinez had insisted on one more procedure, one more test. She'd felt the needle pierce her spine, the cold injection of something they claimed was a nutritional supplement for the baby. The consent forms had been doctored afterward, she was certain of it. By the time she'd realized what they'd really done, it was too late to prove anything. The baby kicked again, harder this time. Fem gasped, stumbling backward as a sharp pain shot through her abdomen. Leo whimpered, pressing against her legs for support. The egg's glow intensified, and she swore she could hear something, a low humming that seemed to resonate in her bones. "It's okay, boy," she whispered to Leo, though her voice shook. "We're just going to watch, from a distance." But even as she spoke, she knew she was lying to herself. The pull was too strong, the connection too obvious to ignore. During her years studying extraterrestrial specimens, she'd never encountered anything that responded to human presence like this. The eggs weren't just incubating, they were waiting for her. The wind picked up, rattling the shed's loose boards. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising to cut them off from the outside world for days. Fem's satellite phone sat dead on the kitchen counter, its battery drained. She'd been meaning to charge it, but something always seemed to distract her. Now she wondered if that had been her choice at all. Inside the largest egg, movement became more distinct. A shadow pressed against the shell from within, stretching the crack wider. Fem found herself taking another step forward, despite Leo's increasingly frantic protests. Her hands moved to her belly again, feeling the baby shift and turn as if responding to whatever was trying to emerge mere feet away. The first piece of shell fell away with a wet sound that made Fem's stomach lurch. What she glimpsed inside defied immediate comprehension, something that was neither fully organic nor entirely artificial. It pulsed with the same rhythm as her own heartbeat, as her baby's movements. "Jesus," she breathed, finally understanding. The experiments at Kepler hadn't just been about studying alien life forms, they'd been about creating hybrid specimens. And she'd been carrying one for 8 months. Leo's barking reached a fever pitch as more shell fragments scattered across the shed floor. The thing inside was almost free now, and with each crack of breaking shell, Fem felt her baby respond more violently. Whatever was hatching wasn't just connected to her child, it was calling to it. As the storm clouds opened and rain began to fall, Fem realized she faced an impossible choice. Destroy the creatures that might be her baby's siblings, or protect them from a world that would never understand. Either way, her quiet sanctuary was about to become ground zero for something that would change everything. The largest egg split completely open, and what emerged made Fem's blood run cold. It was beautiful, it was terrible, and it was looking directly at her with eyes that seemed almost human. The morning light filtering through the cabin's frost-covered windows did nothing to diminish the unease that had settled in Fem's chest like a stone. She stood at the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, watching Leo pace restlessly by the back door. His behavior hadn't improved overnight. If anything, it had gotten worse. Every few minutes, he would whine and scratch at the door frame, his ears pinned back against his skull. When she'd let him out earlier to relieve himself, he'd refused to venture more than a few feet from the porch, his hackles raised as he stared into the tree line with an intensity that made her stomach clench. Fem took a sip of her tea and felt the baby shift inside her, a gentle rolling movement that usually brought her comfort. Today, even that familiar sensation felt different somehow, as though her body was harboring secrets she couldn't decode. She pressed her free hand to her swollen belly, trying to shake off the paranoid thoughts that had plagued her since finding those eggs. The rational part of her mind insisted she was overreacting. Unknown species weren't unheard of in remote wilderness areas, especially with climate change pushing creatures into new territories. But her years of experience studying extraterrestrial samples at the research facility had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with what she'd discovered. Leo's sudden bark made her jump, hot tea sloshing over the rim of her mug. Through the window, she could see him standing rigid in the yard, his attention fixed on something beyond her line of sight. The sound that emerged from his throat wasn't his usual alert bark. It was a low, guttural warning that raised the hair on her arms. Setting down her mug, Fem moved to the living room window for a better view. The forest looked peaceful enough in the pale morning light, snow-laden branches creating a Christmas card tableau that should have been comforting. But as she watched, a shadow moved between the trees, something large and fluid that didn't match the gait of any animal she knew. A breath fogged the glass as she leaned closer, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The shadow paused at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of full sunlight, and for a moment she could have sworn it was watching the cabin. Watching her. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, making her gasp and step back from the window. By the time she looked again, the shadow was gone, leaving only the gentle sway of pine boughs in the winter breeze. Leo had stopped barking, but he remained motionless in the yard, every muscle tensed for flight. Fem's hands shook as she reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found Dr. Marcus Chen's number. Marcus had been her supervisor at the xenobiology lab before her pregnancy leave, and if anyone could help her make sense of what she'd found, it would be him. But as she prepared to dial, she hesitated. How could she explain her situation without sounding completely unhinged? The phone buzzed in her hands, a text message from an unknown number. The words on the screen made her blood turn to ice. "We know what you found. Do not contact anyone. We're coming." Her fingers flew over the screen, typing a response, but before she could send it, the message disappeared. Not just from her active conversation, but from her entire message history, as though it had never existed at all. She stared at the blank screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, Leo began to howl, a mournful, desperate sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Fem rushed to the window and saw him backing toward the cabin, his eyes fixed on the forest. The trees themselves seemed different now, their shadows deeper and more angular than they should be in the morning light. As she watched, frozen with terror, one of those shadows detached itself from the tree line and began moving across the snow toward her dog. It had no definable shape. One moment it appeared bipedal, the next it flowed like liquid mercury, leaving no tracks in its wake. Leo's howls grew more frantic as the thing approached, but he didn't run. Instead, he planted himself between the shadow and the cabin, his loyalty overriding his fear. Fem's maternal instincts kicked in with violent intensity. She grabbed her father's old hunting rifle from the closet, checking the chamber with hands that remembered the motions despite years of disuse. The weight of the weapon felt foreign after so long in the sterile world of laboratories, but desperation made her fingers steady. As she moved toward the door, the baby gave another forceful kick, this one accompanied by a strange tingling sensation that spread through her abdomen like electricity. For just a moment, she could have sworn she felt something responding, not from inside her, but from somewhere else entirely. The microscope's eyepiece felt cold against Fem's skin as she adjusted the focus, her breath catching as the cellular structure came into sharp relief. What she saw defied every principle of terrestrial biology she'd spent 15 years studying. The egg's outer membrane wasn't composed of calcium carbonate like bird eggs or the leathery protein matrix of reptilian species. Instead, it appeared to be a complex crystalline lattice interwoven with what looked like neural pathways, microscopic channels that pulsed with a faint bioluminescence. "Impossible," she whispered, pulling back from the microscope. Her hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly, where the baby had been unusually quiet since she'd brought the eggs inside. Even the familiar flutter of tiny limbs had stilled, as if her unborn child sensed something amiss. Leo whined from his position by the door, his ears flattened against his skull. He hadn't moved from that spot in over an hour, maintaining a vigilant watch that made Fem's skin crawl. The golden retriever's usually warm brown eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, a desperate need to communicate something his canine vocal cords couldn't express. She returned to the microscope, this time examining a sample from the egg's interior. The cellular structure was even more bizarre. Hexagonal chambers filled with a substance that seemed to shift between liquid and gas phases. As she watched, the chambers began to pulse in synchronized waves, like a heartbeat captured at the molecular level. The baby kicked suddenly, hard enough to make Fem gasp, then again, more insistently, as if responding to some external stimulus. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the urgent movement beneath her skin. In all her months of pregnancy, she'd never felt such deliberate, almost frantic motion. "Easy, little one," she murmured, but the words felt hollow. Nothing about this situation was easy. A soft crackling sound drew her attention back to the eggs. The largest one, positioned closest to her workspace, had developed a hairline fracture running from apex to base. The fissure glowed with the same bioluminescence she'd observed under magnification, casting ethereal blue patterns across her equipment. Leo's whining intensified, becoming a low, continuous keen that raised the hair on Fem's arms. The dog backed against the door, his claws scratching against the wood as if trying to escape through solid matter. The crack widened with an audible pop, and something moved within the egg's depths. Not the chaotic struggling of a hatching creature, but a deliberate, purposeful shifting. Fem found herself leaning forward despite every instinct screaming at her to run. Her scientific curiosity warred with a primal terror she couldn't name. A tendril emerged from the crack, translucent, segmented, and impossibly graceful. It tested the air with delicate, questing motions before withdrawing back into the shell. The bioluminescent glow intensified, and Fem realized the light wasn't random. It pulsed in patterns, complex sequences that reminded her of neural firing patterns in developing embryos. Her laptop chimed with an incoming message, the sound jarringly mundane in the charged atmosphere. The email was from Dr. Reeves, her former research partner at the Xenobiology Institute. The subject line made her blood freeze, urgent, regarding the Kepler 442b specimens. Fem's fingers trembled as she opened the message. 3 words dominated the screen: "Destroy them immediately." Below that, a longer paragraph that made her vision blur at the edges. "Fem, if you found them, you need to incinerate everything now." The containment breach at the facility wasn't accidental. They called to their own kind. The neural resonance frequency matches human brainwave patterns during fetal development. Whatever you do, don't let them hatch. The connection you discovered in your research, it goes both ways. The baby's movements became violent, painful kicks that drove Femme to her knees. She clutched her stomach, gasping as waves of sensation that weren't quite pain but weren't normal pregnancy symptoms either coursed through her body. It felt like the neural firing patterns she'd observed in the egg samples were somehow echoing in her own nervous system. The largest egg split open with a wet, organic sound. What emerged wasn't the amorphous creature Femme expected, but something that made her mind struggle to process what she was seeing. It possessed a symmetry that was almost mathematical in its precision, 6 primary appendages arranged around a central core that pulsed with complex light patterns. But it was the intelligence in its movements that truly terrified her. The creature oriented toward her immediately, its bioluminescent core cycling through patterns that seemed to mirror the rhythm of her own heartbeat. When it began moving in her direction with deliberate, unhurried purpose, Femme understood with crystalline clarity that this wasn't a random encounter. It had been waiting for her specifically. Leo's barking became frantic, desperate, as 2 more eggs began showing stress fractures. The dog lunged toward Femme, grabbing her sleeve in his teeth and pulling with surprising strength toward the door. The creature's light patterns suddenly synchronized with the frantic flutter of movement in her womb. The eggs had grown overnight. Femme stood in her makeshift laboratory, morning coffee forgotten in her trembling hand as she stared at the specimens. What had been golf ball-sized yesterday now resembled small melons, their surfaces pulsing with a rhythm that made her stomach clench. The translucent shells revealed dark shapes moving within, coiling and uncoiling like restless serpents. Leo whined from the doorway, refusing to enter the room. His hackles had been raised since dawn, and he'd taken to positioning himself between Femme and the lab whenever she approached. She'd never seen him so agitated, not even during the worst storms that rattled the cabin's foundation. "It's impossible," she whispered, setting down her mug with shaking fingers. Biological growth didn't work this way. Even the most aggressive parasite she'd studied required weeks to reach maturity, not hours. She pulled out her phone to document the change, but the screen flickered with static the moment she aimed it at the eggs. The electromagnetic interference was getting worse. Her satellite internet had failed completely, cutting her off from the research databases she desperately needed to access. The radio produced only white noise punctuated by strange harmonics that seemed to synchronize with the eggs pulsing. She forced herself to approach the containment unit, noting that the temperature had risen several degrees despite the climate controls. The air itself felt thick, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. As she leaned closer, one of the eggs shifted, and she caught a glimpse of something that made her blood freeze. An eye. Definitely an eye, but wrong in every conceivable way. Too large, too knowing, with a pupil that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It tracked her movement through the translucent shell, and she could have sworn she saw recognition in its alien gaze. Femme stumbled backward, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her surge of fear. She'd felt increased fetal movement since finding the eggs, along with strange dreams that left her gasping and disoriented, dreams of vast spaces between stars, of worlds where geometry followed rules that hurt to contemplate. Leo's whining intensified, and she turned to see him backing away from the lab entrance, his ears flattened against his skull. Following his gaze, she noticed something that made her heart skip. A thin crack had appeared in the largest egg's shell. The crack spread as she watched, branching out in patterns that reminded her of neural networks, or perhaps some form of alien circuitry. The pulsing grew more rapid, and a sound began to emerge from within, a wet, rhythmic scratching like claws on bone. She grabbed her emergency kit and backed toward the door, but something compelled her to look back. The crack had widened, and a dark fluid was seeping out, defying gravity as it flowed upward in spiraling tendrils. Where the fluid touched the air, it seemed to bend light around it, creating distortions that made her eyes water. "Jesus Christ," she breathed, and at the sound of her voice, all 3 eggs began to crack in unison. The rational part of her mind screamed to run, to grab Leo and her truck keys and get as far from the cabin as possible. But her scientific training held her frozen, documenting every detail even as terror flooded her system. The cracks were forming symbols now, hieroglyphs that seemed familiar despite being utterly alien. She'd seen similar patterns before, but where? Memory hit her like a physical blow. The archaeological dig in Peru 15 years ago, the pre-Incan ruins where she'd first met her ex-husband Marcus. They'd found stone tablets covered in similar markings, along with fossilized remains that had never been properly classified. The dig had been shut down after the local workers fled, claiming the site was cursed. She and Marcus had laughed at their superstitions then. Marcus. She hadn't thought about him in years, not since the bitter divorce and the restraining order. But now his face filled her mind with startling clarity, along with his obsession with extraterrestrial contact. He'd believed the Peruvian symbols were messages, instructions left by visitors from another world. She'd dismissed it as fantasy, but what if... A sharp crack interrupted her thoughts. The largest egg was splitting open, revealing glimpses of what writhed within. She caught sight of segmented appendages, of flesh that seemed to shift between textures and colors, of organs that pulsed with their own inner light. Leo erupted in frantic barking, his voice taking on a pitch she'd never heard before. The sound seemed to agitate whatever was emerging from the eggs, and their movements became more violent. The containment unit rattled as the creatures pressed against their confines. Fem realized with growing horror that the unit wouldn't hold them much longer. The reinforced glass was already showing stress fractures, and the temperature readings were climbing toward dangerous levels. She had minutes at most before whatever was in those eggs broke free. As if sensing her thoughts, the largest creature pressed what might have been a face against the shell's opening. The alien eye fixed on her with unmistakable intelligence, and its pupil dilated with what looked disturbingly like hunger. The eggs had changed overnight. Fem stood in the doorway of the spare room, her hand instinctively moving to her belly as she stared at the translucent spheres. What had been smooth, pearl-like surfaces yesterday now showed a network of dark veins pulsing beneath the membrane. The veins moved with a rhythmic pattern that made her stomach clench. It reminded her too much of a heartbeat. Leo whined softly beside her, his ears flattened against his head. He hadn't left her side since she'd woken up, pressing close to her legs as if trying to shield her from something she couldn't see. "I know, boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Something's not right." The largest egg, the one she'd first discovered, seemed to have grown overnight. It now stretched nearly 8 inches in diameter, and the veining was most pronounced across its surface. As she watched, something shifted inside, a shadow that moved with deliberate purpose. A tablet buzzed from the kitchen, and she nearly jumped out of her skin. Leo barked once, sharp and warning, before she shushed him with a gentle touch. The message was from Dr. Sarah Chen, her former research partner at the Kepler Institute. Fem's hands trembled slightly as she read, "Fem, tried calling but no signal. Urgent you contact me immediately. Found something in the archived files about your father's research. The Project Chrysalis documents weren't fully destroyed. We need to talk. This is about the specimens he was working with before the incident." The tablet slipped from Fem's fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor. Leo immediately moved to investigate, sniffing the device before looking up at her with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand far more than they should. Project Chrysalis. She hadn't heard that name in 15 years, not since the fire that had consumed her father's laboratory and taken him with it. The official reports had said it was an electrical malfunction, but Fem had always suspected there was more to the story. Her father had been obsessed with something in those final months, working late into the night, muttering about evolutionary leaps and symbiotic potential. A soft cracking sound echoed from the spare room. Fem's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Leo was already moving, positioning himself between her and the hallway, his hackles raised in a ridge along his spine. The cracking came again, followed by what sounded like liquid dripping onto the hardwood floor. She forced herself to move, each step feeling like she was walking through quicksand. The smell hit her first, ozone and something organic, like the ocean, but wrong somehow. Then she saw the source. The largest egg had developed a hairline crack running from its apex to its base. Clear fluid leaked from the fissure, pooling on the floor and eating small holes in the wood like acid. As she watched, the crack widened slightly, and something pressed against the membrane from inside. Whatever was in there was trying to get out. Her phone had no signal. It never did this far from town. But the landline in the kitchen still worked. She could call for help, but who would believe her? And what if they arrived too late? Or worse, what if they took the eggs for study? The thought of anyone else going through what her father had experienced made her physically ill. The baby kicked inside her, a strong flutter that reminded her why she couldn't simply run. She was 6 months along, isolated in the mountains with the nearest neighbor 20 miles away. Even if she left now, where would she go? And what if moving the eggs somehow accelerated whatever was happening? Leo pressed against her legs, and she looked down to see him staring intently at the cracked egg. His nose twitched, and she realized he was detecting something she couldn't. Some scent or pheromone that was setting off every alarm in his canine brain. Another crack appeared on a second egg, this one spiderwebbing across the surface in an intricate pattern. The veins beneath pulsed faster now, and she could swear she heard something. A sound so low it was almost subsonic, thrumming through the floorboards and into her bones. Her father's journal. The thought struck her like lightning. She'd kept it all these years, hidden away in her bedroom closet. If Project Chrysalis was connected to this, if these eggs were somehow related to his research, then maybe his notes contained answers. Maybe they contained a way to stop whatever was about to emerge. The cracking sound came again, louder this time, and she saw a small piece of shell fall away from the largest egg. The hole it left behind was perfectly round and dark, like an eye socket, like something was looking out. Femme backed away slowly, Leo moving with her in perfect synchronization. The thrumming sound grew stronger, and she felt it resonating in her chest, in her belly, as if whatever was inside those eggs was calling to something deep within her own body. She had to find that journal. She had to understand what her father had unleashed before she became part of it. The microscope's LED light cast harsh shadows across Femme's face as she adjusted the focus for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly, whether from exhaustion, pregnancy hormones, or the growing dread in her chest she couldn't say. The sample from the cracked egg sat perfectly centered on the slide, its cellular structure unlike anything in her 15 years of xenobiology research. Leo whined from his position by the door, ears still pinned back. He hadn't left that spot since she'd brought the sample inside, as if standing guard against something only he could sense. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" she murmured, not lifting her eyes from the scope. The cells were wrong, not just alien, wrong. They shifted and pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost familiar, like a half-remembered song. Each cell contained multiple nuclei that danced around each other in patterns that defied conventional biology. But it was the way they responded to her presence that made her skin crawl. When she'd first placed the sample under magnification, the cells had been relatively dormant. Now, after 20 minutes of observation, they were increasingly active, almost agitated, as if they knew they were being watched, as if they were watching back. Femme reached for her digital camera to document the findings, but froze when she noticed something new. The cells were organizing themselves into clusters, forming geometric patterns that looked disturbingly like neural networks. The formations pulsed in unison, creating waves of bioluminescence that rippled across the slide. Her unborn child kicked sharply, making her gasp. The movement was different from the usual gentle flutters, urgent, almost frantic. She placed a protective hand over her swollen belly, trying to calm both the baby and her own racing heart. The sat phone rang. Leo's bark exploded through the cabin, sharp and aggressive. He stood rigid, hackles raised, staring at the phone as if it were a coiled snake. Fem hesitated. The only people who had this number were her research supervisor and the medical team monitoring her pregnancy. Given the storm and the late hour, any call was likely an emergency. She picked up on the fourth ring. "Dr. Fem?" The voice was unfamiliar, distorted by static and interference. "This is Dr. Chen from the Vancouver Research Institute. We need to talk." "I don't know any Dr. Chen," Fem replied, her xenobiologist training kicking in. "Always verify credentials. How did you get this number?" "Your supervisor, Dr. Morrison, gave it to me. We've been monitoring some unusual readings from your area, electromagnetic anomalies that match patterns we've seen before." The line crackled with interference, but underneath the static, Fem could swear she heard something else, a rhythmic pulsing that matched the cellular activity under her microscope. "Seen before where?" she pressed. "Kamchatka Peninsula, 1987. Outback Australia, 1993. Northern Quebec, 2001. Always the same pattern. Always near pregnant researchers." Fem's blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" "Check your records." Dr. Fem really checked them. "Your assignment to that cabin wasn't random. The eggs you found, you were meant to find them. You're part of something that started long before you were born. The phone went dead." Fem stared at the silent device, her mind reeling. Leo had stopped barking but remained alert, his eyes fixed on something outside the window. Following his gaze, she saw only darkness and her own reflection in the glass, but for a moment she could swear there was something else, a shadow that moved independent of her own movements. She turned back to the microscope, needing the familiar comfort of scientific observation, but what she saw made her stumble backward. The cells had multiplied. What had been a small sample now covered nearly the entire slide, and the geometric patterns had become impossibly complex. They formed spirals within spirals, fractals that seemed to extend beyond the two-dimensional plane of the slide. And at the center of it all was something that made her throat close with recognition. A double helix. DNA. But not just any DNA. The structure was too familiar, too specific. She'd seen this exact pattern before, in her own genetic sequencing from the pregnancy screenings. It was her DNA. The alien cells were incorporating her genetic material, learning from it, adapting to it. Her child kicked again, harder this time, and Fem felt something she'd never experienced before, the distinct sensation that she wasn't alone in her own body, that something was sharing space with her unborn child, whispering to it in frequencies she couldn't hear but somehow felt in her bones. Outside, the storm intensified, but the wind now carried sounds that weren't quite natural. Leo's growl became a constant rumble, and his eyes never left the window. Fem grabbed her research notes with shaking hands, flipping through months of data with new understanding. The electromagnetic readings, the unusual wildlife behavior, the perfect isolation of the cabin. It was all connected, all planned. She wasn't here to study the eggs. She was here to incubate them. The morning light filtering through the cabin windows revealed the true extent of what had happened overnight. Fem stood in the doorway of her makeshift laboratory, one hand pressed protectively over her swollen belly, the other gripping the doorframe for support. Where she had left 3 pristine, pearl-like eggs in their containment units, now only fragments remained, crystalline shards that caught the early sunlight and threw it back in fractured rainbows across the scattered papers and overturned equipment. Leo pressed against her legs, whimpering low in his throat. His ears were pinned back, and she could feel the tremor running through his powerful frame. Whatever had emerged from those eggs, her dog's ancient instincts recognized it as something fundamentally wrong. She forced herself to step into the room, glass crunching under her boots. The containment units had been breached from the inside, their reinforced walls sporting circular holes that appeared to have been burned rather than broken. The edges were smooth, almost surgical in their precision. She knelt carefully, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, and examined one of the larger shell fragments. The material felt warm against her fingertips, warmer than the ambient temperature should have allowed. Under magnification, she could see that the shell's inner surface was lined with what looked like neural pathways, delicate, branching structures that pulsed faintly with bioluminescent activity even in death. She had never seen anything like it in any terrestrial organism. A soft scratching sound from above made her freeze. Leo's whimpering intensified, and he began backing toward the door, his hackles rising in a ridge along his spine. The sound came again, deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across wood, but it was coming from inside the ceiling. Fem's blood turned to ice water. The crawl space above her laboratory connected to the entire cabin's attic system. Whatever had emerged from the eggs was no longer contained to this room. She grabbed her tablet and began photographing everything: the destroyed containment units, the shell fragments, the burn patterns. Her scientific training kicked in even as terror clawed at her chest. If something happened to her, if these things posed a threat to others, there needed to be a record. The scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, she could hear her own heartbeat and Leo's panting breath. Then, from somewhere above the kitchen, came a different sound. A wet, sliding noise, like something large and boneless moving through the narrow spaces between the walls. Leo bolted from the room, his claws skittering on the hardwood floors as he raced toward the kitchen. Fem followed as quickly as her condition allowed, arriving just in time to see her dog standing rigid before the pantry, his teeth bared in a silent snarl at something she couldn't see. The sliding sound came again, closer now, accompanied by what might have been breathing if breathing could sound like steam escaping from a pressure valve. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if it too sensed the wrongness permeating the cabin. A memory surfaced unbidden, her mother's journal, the one she had found after the funeral, filled with sketches of creatures that couldn't exist and notes about research that had no basis in any legitimate science. She had dismissed it as the paranoid ravings of a woman whose mind had been consumed by isolation and guilt. But some of those sketches had featured elongated forms with multiple limbs, creatures that seemed to exist in the spaces between the real and the impossible. The ceiling above the pantry began to bulge downward, as if something heavy was pressing against it from above. Flakes of paint drifted down like snow, and she could see the wooden beams beginning to strain under an impossible weight. Leo erupted into frantic barking, lunging toward the pantry and then retreating, his protective instincts warring with his terror. Fem grabbed his collar and began pulling him toward the front door, her movements clumsy with urgency and the awkward bulk of her pregnancy. The ceiling gave way with a sound like breaking bones. Something dropped into the pantry in a cascade of plaster dust and splintered wood. Fem caught only a glimpse of it through the open door, pale, glistening flesh that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury, appendages that might have been arms or legs or something else entirely, and eyes that reflected the morning light with an intelligence that was utterly, horrifyingly alien. She reached the front door and yanked it open, Leo racing past her into the yard. As she stumbled after him, she heard the thing in the pantry moving, exploring its new environment with sounds that made her skin crawl. Glass shattered, probably her kitchen windows, and she realized it was learning, adapting, finding new ways to navigate the human environment it found itself in. The morning air hit her face like a blessing, clean and free of the wrongness that now permeated her cabin. But as she stood, gasping in her yard, one hand on Leo's head and the other cradling her unborn child, she knew that running wasn't an option. Whatever connection existed between these creatures and her family's past, whatever her mother had been involved in, it had followed her here, and it wasn't finished with them yet. The laboratory felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, as if the very air had thickened with malevolent purpose. Fem's hands trembled as she activated the emergency protocols, sealing the reinforced doors and windows with titanium shutters that dropped from hidden compartments. The mechanical whirring filled the silence, but it couldn't drown out Leo's continued whimpering from behind the steel barrier she'd erected between the main lab and her makeshift command center. She'd managed to salvage 3 intact samples from the carnage, their translucent surfaces now pulsing with an irregular rhythm that made her stomach lurch. Under the electron microscope's harsh glare, the organisms revealed themselves to be unlike anything in terrestrial biology. They possessed a crystalline internal structure that seemed to bend light in impossible ways, and their cellular walls contained trace elements that shouldn't exist on Earth. The spectrometer readings made no sense. Isotopes with half-lives measured in geological epochs, protein chains that folded in dimensions her equipment couldn't properly map, and most disturbing of all, a genetic sequence that triggered a memory she'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing encrypted files buried deep in her personal archive. The Kepler 442b expedition. Project Prometheus. The samples they'd brought back before the colony went dark and the corporate cover-up began. She'd been junior staff then, barely out of graduate school, but she remembered the excitement of first contact, the way Dr. Hassan's eyes had lit up when the preliminary results came through. And she remembered what had happened next. The current sample's DNA profile matched the Prometheus specimens with 97% accuracy. Impossible, yet undeniable. These things had somehow followed her across light years and 15 years of carefully constructed new identity. The question that clawed at her mind wasn't how they'd found her, but why they'd waited so long to make contact. A sharp crack echoed through the lab, and Fem's blood froze. One of the samples had split open, revealing not the larval form she'd expected, but something far worse. The creature inside was humanoid but wrong, its proportions subtly off in ways that triggered deep evolutionary revulsion. Its skin held the same translucent quality as the egg, and through it she could see organs that pulsed with bioluminescent rhythms. It turned toward her with movements too fluid for its apparent bone structure, and when it opened what might charitably be called a mouth, the sound that emerged bypassed her ears entirely and resonated directly in her skull. The communication wasn't words but pure meaning, concepts forced into her consciousness with surgical precision. We have been waiting. The child carries the bridge. The circle closes. Femme stumbled backward, her hands instinctively moving to protect her swollen belly. The baby kicked frantically, as if responding to some stimulus she couldn't perceive. The creature's attention focused on her abdomen with predatory intensity, and she realized with mounting horror that her unborn child wasn't an innocent bystander in this encounter. The Prometheus mission had exposed her to more than just alien organisms. The decontamination procedures had failed, just as they'd failed for Dr. Hassan and the rest of the team. But while the others had died screaming in quarantine, she'd survived, seemingly unaffected. The medical reports had declared her clean, and she'd believed them, desperate to escape the nightmares and start fresh. Now she understood that survival had come with a price she'd never suspected. The organisms hadn't killed her because they'd needed her alive, needed her to carry their genetic modifications forward. Every cell in her body had been subtly altered, her reproductive system transformed into an incubator for something that was both human and utterly alien. The baby wasn't just her child, it was their child too. Leo's barking reached a new pitch of desperation, and she could hear him throwing himself against the barrier with enough force to dent the reinforced steel. Whatever was happening to the other specimens, he knew it spelled disaster for them all. The emergency lights began flashing red as her containment systems registered cascading failures throughout the lab. More cracks echoed from the remaining samples, and Femme made a decision that went against every scientific instinct she possessed. She grabbed the emergency thermite charges from their wall mount, designed to sterilize the lab in case of catastrophic contamination breach. Her hands shook as she input the activation codes, knowing that she had perhaps minutes before the other creatures emerged fully formed. The first creature watched her preparations with what might have been amusement, its alien features shifting in patterns that suggested facial expressions evolution had never intended. It spoke again, the words bypassing language entirely. "You cannot destroy what lives within you." The birth approaches. We will be whole. As if summoned by its words, a contraction seized her abdomen with unexpected violence. The baby was coming, weeks ahead of schedule, and Fem realized with crystalline clarity that the timing was no coincidence. Everything had been orchestrated for this moment, this place, this convergence of alien intelligence and human biology. The thermite charges armed with electronic beeps that counted down toward obliteration, while outside the sealed laboratory, something vast and patient began to sing. The basement felt different now, as if the very air had thickened with malevolent intent. Fem descended the creaking wooden stairs, her flashlight beam cutting through shadows that seemed to writhe and retreat. Leo pressed close against her legs, his entire body trembling with barely contained terror. The eggs were larger. Where yesterday they had been the size of ostrich eggs, now they loomed before her like grotesque watermelons, their surfaces pulsing with veins of bioluminescent fluid. The organic pods had spread too, creeping across the basement floor in twisted tendrils that reminded her of neural networks. The smell hit her immediately, sweet decay mixed with something metallic and alien. "Jesus," she whispered, one hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her fear. Leo growled low in his throat, hackles raised. His brown eyes never left the largest egg, positioned at the center of what had become a grotesque nest. Fem followed his gaze and felt her blood turn to ice. Something was moving inside. The translucent shell revealed a dark mass, shifting and coiling within, not random movement, deliberate, purposeful. As she watched, mesmerized by horror, a pattern emerged on the egg's surface, symbols that made her vision blur and her head pound with recognition she couldn't quite grasp. Her phone buzzed. "Dr. Harrison's number. Fem, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Where are you?" "The basement," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Get out. Get out now. Marcus, what aren't you telling me? These things, I've seen them before, haven't I?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by Leo's increasingly agitated whimpering and a wet, organic sound from the eggs. "The Kepler Station incident," Marcus finally said. "You were part of the xenobiology team that analyzed the specimens we brought back. Do you remember anything about the quarantine protocols?" Fem's legs nearly gave out. Fragments of memory crashed through her mind like broken glass. Sterile laboratory corridors, containment units, emergency sirens. Her own voice, younger and more confident, dictating notes about unprecedented cellular adaptation and reproductive cycles. "The memory suppressants," she breathed. "You made us forget." For good reason. The specimens weren't just alive, Fem. They were intelligent, and they had a specific interest in human reproductive systems. The largest egg pulsed, its bioluminescent veins flaring brighter. A hairline crack appeared along its surface, and something that might have been a claw or tentacle pressed against the inside. "How long do I have?" "Minutes, maybe less. The gestation period accelerates in the presence of—" Marcus's voice cut out as a sound like breaking glass echoed through the basement. The egg was hatching. Leo's growl escalated to a full-throated bark as the crack widened, releasing a gush of viscous fluid that steamed in the cool air. Fem stumbled backward, her flashlight beam wavering as something dark and wet began to emerge. Not one creature, but dozens. They poured from the opening like a tide of living shadow, each no larger than her fist, but moving with predatory coordination. Multi-legged, with too many eyes that reflected her light like tiny stars. They spread across the floor in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "Run," she whispered to Leo, but her feet wouldn't obey. The creatures weren't attacking, they were studying her. Dozens of alien gazes focused on her pregnant form with unmistakable hunger. Her baby kicked again, harder this time, and she felt something shift inside her. Not the normal movement of pregnancy, but something else, something responding to the creature's presence. The memory suppressants hadn't worked completely. Images flooded back. The expedition to Kepler Station, the discovery of the derelict ship, the eggs hidden in its cargo hold, and her own exposure to whatever force had created them. She remembered now. Remembered the medical examinations afterward, the concerned whispers of the research team, the way they'd looked at her when the pregnancy test came back positive. She'd thought David was the father, but the timeline was wrong. The exposure had come first. The creatures began to move toward her, not as predators, but as something else, something that recognized kinship. Leo positioned himself between Femme and the advancing swarm, his loyalty overriding his terror, the bravest thing she'd ever seen, and it broke her heart because she knew it wouldn't matter. These things weren't here to harm her. They were here for what she carried. Her unborn child wasn't entirely human. The basement filled with a sound like singing, if songs could be made of frequencies that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to cells and DNA. The remaining eggs began to crack in unison, and Femme finally found the strength to move. She ran for the stairs, Leo at her heels, as her past and future collided in the darkness behind them. Above, the cabin waited, but she knew now that nowhere would be safe. The creatures weren't invaders, they were coming home. The laboratory felt different now, charged with an energy that made Femme's skin crawl. The egg she'd brought inside sat in its containment unit, pulsing with that same rhythmic glow she'd observed outside. But under the harsh fluorescent lights, she could see details that had escaped her notice before, veins of silver threading through the translucent shell and something moving within. Leo refused to enter the lab. He paced in the hallway, whining softly, occasionally letting out low growls directed at the sealed door. Femme had tried to coax him inside twice, but each time he'd backed away, hackles raised, as if the very air beyond the threshold burned him. She pulled up her field notes on the computer, comparing the egg's cellular structure to samples she'd collected years ago during the Kepler mission. The similarities were undeniable, but there were differences too. Evolutionary adaptations that suggested these organisms had been developing, changing, for far longer than should have been possible. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Femme winced, placing a hand over the spot. The movements had become more frequent since she'd brought the egg inside, almost agitated. She tried to convince herself it was coincidence, that her stress was affecting the baby's behavior, but deep down, she knew better. Her tablet chimed with an incoming message. The sender was listed as classified, Kepler Archives, but that was impossible. The Kepler project had been scrubbed from all official records after the incident. She hesitated before opening it. The message contained a single file, a video log dated 3 years ago, during the final days of the mission. Femme's younger face filled the screen, haggard and pale in the stark lighting of the research station. Behind her, containment units lined the walls, each one holding specimens that shouldn't have existed. Personal log, day 847. A recorded voice began. The eggs have been dormant for 6 months. But something's changed. Dr. Martinez thinks the electromagnetic pulses from the planet's core are affecting them, but I'm not so sure. The patterns are too regular, too purposeful. It's almost like they're communicating. Femme felt ice form in her stomach. She didn't remember making this recording. The memory gap from those final weeks had always troubled her, but the psychologists had assured her it was trauma-related, her mind's way of protecting her from the horror of what had happened to the rest of the team. On screen, her younger self leaned closer to the camera. I need to document this because if something happens to me, someone needs to know. The eggs aren't just alien specimens. They're connected to something larger, something that's been waiting. And I think... The recording cut to static. A new message appeared immediately. They remember you, Femme, just as you're beginning to remember them. Her hands shook as she deleted the message, but it was too late. The memories were surfacing now, fragments at first, then rushing back like a dam bursting, the research station, the screaming, Martinez's face as something burst from his chest, and the voice in her head, ancient and patient, promising her things she desperately wanted to forget. The egg's pulsing intensified, and hairline cracks appeared across its surface. Femme stumbled backward, knocking over her chair. In the hallway, Leo's whining became frantic barking. The lights flickered, and for a moment she could swear she heard something else, a sound like whispers, like chittering, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and suddenly Femme understood. The nausea, the strange cravings, the way her body had felt wrong ever since returning from Kepler. She'd thought it was just the aftermath of trauma, the stress of losing her team. But the timeline was wrong. She'd been back on Earth for 3 years, and she was only 7 months pregnant. Her pregnancy hadn't begun here. It had begun there, on that distant world, in those final days she couldn't remember. The thing growing inside her wasn't entirely human, and the eggs weren't random arrivals. They were a homecoming. The containment unit cracked with a sound like breaking glass. Femme backed toward the door as something small and pale pushed its way out of the egg, unfurling delicate limbs that ended in razor-sharp points. It turned toward her with eyeless sockets that somehow still managed to convey recognition, intelligence, hunger. Leo's barking reached a fever pitch. The creature in the containment unit tilted its head as if listening, then opened what might have been a mouth and let out a sound that was part shriek, part song. From outside, Femme heard answering calls from the remaining eggs. The baby inside her went still, completely motionless for the first time in months. In that sudden quiet, Femme felt something else, a presence pressing against her consciousness, familiar and terrible. The voice she'd heard in her nightmares, the one she'd thought was just trauma-induced hallucination, whispered lovingly in her mind. "Welcome home, my dear. We've been waiting so very long for you to remember what you truly are." The basement laboratory felt different now, charged with an energy that made Femme's skin crawl. She descended the wooden stairs slowly, one hand gripping the railing, the other resting protectively over her swollen belly. Leo pressed against her legs, whimpering softly, his hackles raised in permanent alarm. The eggs had changed overnight. Where before they'd been smooth, pearl-like spheres, now they pulsed with bioluminescent veins that traced intricate patterns across their surfaces. The neural pathways she'd observed under the microscope had somehow manifested externally, creating a living circuit board that throbbed with alien purpose. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, pulling out her phone to document the transformation. The camera struggled to focus, as if the eggs existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. When she finally managed to capture an image, the photograph showed only empty air. The temperature readings on her equipment had spiked during the night. Not heat, something else entirely. The electromagnetic sensors were going haywire, registering impossible fluctuations that defied every law of physics she'd studied. Whatever was growing inside those shells operated on principles completely foreign to terrestrial life. Leo growled low in his throat, backing toward the stairs. His instincts had been right from the beginning. She should have listened, should have destroyed the eggs the moment she'd found them. But scientific curiosity had always been her weakness, the driving force that had led her to the stars and, ultimately, to this isolated exile. A memory surfaced unbidden, the Kepler mission, that last desperate transmission from the science team on Kepler 442b. She'd been in the communication center when it came through, garbled and desperate. The children? They're not. God help us. They're using the children. The transmission had cut to static. 3 months later, the rescue team found the colony empty, except for strange, pearl-like structures scattered throughout the research facility, structures that had been classified and buried so deep that even she, as mission xenobiologist, had never seen the full reports. But she recognized them now. The largest egg cracked. A hairline fracture appeared along its equator, leaking viscous fluid that steamed as it hit the concrete floor. The liquid moved with purpose, flowing in deliberate patterns that reminded her of neural pathways seeking connections. Where it touched the walls, the concrete began to change, developing the same luminescent veins that covered the eggs. "No, no, no," she breathed, backing toward the stairs. But Leo was already gone, his claws scrabbling on the wooden steps above. Smart dog, smarter than his mistress. The crack widened with an audible snap, and something pressed against the gap from within, not pushing outward like a normal hatching, pulling the shell apart with deliberate intelligence. Tiny appendages, translucent and writhing, emerged to grip the edges of the break. Fem's baby kicked violently, as if responding to some unheard signal. The movement was so sudden and forceful that she gasped, doubling over. When she straightened, the thing in the egg was watching her with eyes that reflected her own face in multifaceted obsidian. It was beautiful in the way that nightmares could be beautiful, perfectly formed but utterly wrong. Its limbs moved with too many joints, bending in directions that hurt to observe. The translucent skin revealed organs that pulsed with that same alien light, and when it opened what might have been a mouth, she heard her own voice echoing back at her. "Femme," it said in perfect mimicry, though its vocal apparatus should have been incapable of human speech. "Femme, help me." The words hit her like physical blows. She'd heard those exact syllables before, recorded in the black box data from the Kepler mission. Dr. Sarah Chen's final transmission, playing on loop as something that wore her colleague's voice, had called for help that would never come. The creature extracted itself fully from the shell, standing barely a foot tall, but radiating an intelligence that made Fem's skin crawl. It took a tentative step toward her, leaving footprints that glowed briefly before fading. "I know you," it whispered, tilting its head with predatory curiosity. "I remember you from before. You came to us among the stars, and now we come to you." Her baby kicked again, harder this time, and Femme felt something fundamental shift inside her. Not just the physical sensation of pregnancy, but something deeper, a recognition that made her blood turn to ice. The other eggs were cracking now, responding to their siblings' emergence. The basement filled with the sound of breaking shells and that horrible mimicked voice, multiplying into a chorus of her own words, spoken by throats that should never have known human language. She turned and ran, taking the stairs two at a time despite her condition. Behind her, the creatures called her name in perfect unison, their voices layering into harmonies that spoke of vast intelligence and patient hunger. At the top of the stairs, she slammed the door and threw the bolt, knowing it would only buy her moments. The things below had crossed impossible distances to find her, and they weren't finished with her yet. The basement laboratory felt different now, charged with an energy that made the air itself seem alive. Femme stood before the main workstation, her hands trembling as she accessed the encrypted files she'd hoped never to open again. Leo pressed against her legs, his warmth a steadying presence as the memories she'd buried clawed their way back to the surface. The screen flickered to life, displaying Project Chrysalis in stark detail. Her younger self stared back from personnel photos, eyes bright with scientific ambition, unmarked by the horror that would follow. Dr. Marcus Huell's face appeared in the next frame, his predatory smile unchanged even in the sterile documentation. "God help me," she whispered, scrolling through the research protocols. What did we do? The files revealed everything she'd tried to forget: the expeditions to remote planets, the discovery of dormant genetic material in crystalline matrices, the attempts to create hybrid organisms capable of surviving in hostile environments, and then the breakthrough that had changed everything, the realization that the alien genetic code wasn't random but purposefully designed. Leo whined softly, his nose bumping against her swollen belly. The baby responded with a flutter of movement that sent ice through her veins. According to these files, the hybrid embryos had shown unprecedented adaptability, their genetics rewriting themselves to match their host environment. But they'd also demonstrated something else: an ability to influence their carriers, to alter maternal biochemistry in ways that went beyond normal pregnancy. A tablet chimed with an incoming transmission. The screen split, revealing Huell's angular face against a backdrop of sterile white walls. His smile was exactly as she remembered, cold and calculating. "Hello, Femma. You look well. Pregnancy suits you. You bastard." The words escaped before she could stop them. "How long have you been watching me?" "Since you disappeared from the project, naturally. Did you really think we'd let our most valuable researcher simply walk away?" His eyes glittered with satisfaction, especially one carrying such precious cargo. The basement seemed to shrink around her. "You knew about the baby, about what it might be. You've been manipulating this entire situation." "Not manipulating, facilitating." Hewell leaned forward, his face filling more of the screen. "The eggs weren't an accident, Femma. They were a delivery system. The genetic material needed a compatible host, and you've been exposed to enough of our research to serve as the perfect incubator." Leo's growl deepened, the sound reverberating through the confined space. The dog's hackles rose as if he could sense Hewell's presence through the transmission. "The creatures that emerged," Fem said, her voice barely steady, "they're connected to what's happening to me." "Beautiful, aren't they? Early-stage scouts, designed to prepare the environment for more complex life forms. Your proximity to them during their emergence phase has accelerated the process considerably." Hewell's expression grew almost paternal. "Your child will be remarkable, Femma, the first true hybrid capable of bridging two worlds." The baby kicked hard, and Fem gasped, pressing her hand to her side. The movement felt different now, not the normal restlessness of a developing infant, but something more purposeful, something aware. "You're insane if you think I'll let you use my child for your experiments." "Use her?" Hewell's laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, my dear girl, you misunderstand completely. We're not going to use her, she's going to use us. The genetic template isn't designed to create a servant species, it's meant to establish dominance." The transmission cut out, leaving Fem alone with the humming equipment and Leo's increasingly agitated whining. She scrolled frantically through more files, searching for anything that might help her understand what was happening. Technical readouts blurred past, genetic sequences, metabolic analyses, behavioral studies, until one document stopped her cold. "Maternal subject 001, post-exposure analysis." The file contained detailed observations of another researcher who had been exposed to the alien genetic material. The woman's pregnancy had progressed normally at first, but by the third trimester, significant changes had begun manifesting. Enhanced reflexes, altered brain chemistry, an almost telepathic connection to other hybrid organisms in the vicinity. The final entry made her blood freeze. Subject terminated pregnancy at 36 weeks. Infant displayed full cognitive development at birth, demonstrating immediate awareness of environment and complex problem-solving capabilities. Recommend immediate containment and study. Leo's bark shattered her focus. Through the basement's single window, she could see movement in the tree line. Not the shambling gait of the creatures she'd encountered before, but something more coordinated, more intelligent. They were coming back. Fem's hand moved instinctively to her belly, feeling the strong rhythmic movements within. The baby wasn't just responding to external stimuli anymore, she was communicating. Each kick felt like a message, a signal being sent to something waiting in the darkness beyond the cabin. The lights flickered, and in that moment of uncertainty, Fem realized the terrible truth. The creatures hadn't been hunting her at all, they'd been protecting her, ensuring she remained safe until their queen could be born. The basement felt like a tomb, thick with the stench of decay and something else, something alien that made Fem's sinuses burn. Leo pressed against her legs, his body trembling with barely contained terror as they descended the creaking wooden stairs. Each step seemed to echo through the foundation of the cabin like a death knell. The flashlight beam swept across the concrete walls, revealing deep scratches gouged into the stone. They weren't random marks. They formed patterns, spiraling designs that hurt to look at directly. Fem's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby had gone completely still. "What did you do down here, Dad?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the oppressive darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, her light caught something that made her stomach lurch. A makeshift laboratory stretched across the far wall, tables covered with glass containers, notebooks and equipment she didn't recognize. But it was the specimens floating in the jars that made her blood run cold. They looked like embryos, but wrong somehow. Twisted versions of human development with too many limbs, eyes in places they shouldn't be, and appendages that belonged to no earthly creature. Labels beneath each jar bore dates going back 25 years, right around the time she was born. Leo whined and backed toward the stairs, but Femme forced herself forward. Her father's journal lay open on the central table, its pages filled with his familiar handwriting. She read the entries with growing horror. Day 847, the specimens continued to develop beyond expected parameters. The hybrid genetics are more stable than anticipated. Subject F shows remarkable adaptation to human physiology. Subject F Femme's legs nearly gave out as the implication hit her. She flipped through more pages, finding photographs that made her gorge rise. Images of the creatures that had emerged from the eggs, but younger, smaller, and mixed among them. Pictures of herself as a child, with notations about her development, her unusual resistance to diseases, her accelerated healing. No, 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 she breathed, but the evidence was undeniable. Another entry caught her eye. Day 1203. F continues to show no awareness of her true nature. The human DNA has successfully masked the alien markers, but they remain dormant. Pregnancy may trigger the awakening. Must prepare for that eventuality. The notebook slipped from her trembling hands. Everything made sense now. Her father's isolation, his secretive research, his insistence that she never venture into the basement. He hadn't been studying the creatures, he'd been studying her. A sound from upstairs made them both freeze. Heavy footsteps crossed the living room floor, too deliberate to be random settling. Leo's hackles rose as a low growl rumbled in his throat. Femme grabbed the journal and several of the specimen jars, stuffing them into her jacket pockets. Whatever was up there, she needed answers first. As they crept back up the stairs, she noticed something else that chilled her. Fresh scratches on the basement walls, marks that definitely hadn't been there when they'd come down. The footsteps overhead had stopped. Femme eased the basement door open and peered into the kitchen. The back door stood wide open, cold air streaming through. But what made her heart skip was the trail of dark, viscous fluid leading from the door to the hallway, the same substance she'd seen around the hatched eggs. Leo's growl intensified. Through the kitchen window, Femme could see shapes moving in the tree line, tall, angular figures that seemed to flow rather than walk. They were gathering, waiting. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Come outside, Femme. It's time to come home." The baby suddenly kicked violently, as if responding to some signal she couldn't hear. The movement felt different now, stronger, more purposeful. She looked down at her belly and saw something that made her bite back a scream. Dark veins had appeared beneath the skin, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. "The pregnancy is the trigger," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. The alien genetics her father had embedded in her DNA were awakening, responding to the presence of their offspring. And the baby, God help her, what was growing inside her? Leo barked sharply, drawing her attention to the living room. One of the creatures stood silhouetted in the front doorway. Up close, she could see it clearly for the first time. It was humanoid but elongated, with skin that seemed to shift between textures. Its face was almost human, except for the eyes, black, multifaceted things that reflected her flashlight beam like a kaleidoscope. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that resonated in her bones. "Sister," it said, and the word carried weight of recognition, of kinship she didn't want to acknowledge. "You have carried our gift long enough. It is time for the awakening." Femme backed toward the kitchen, Leo staying between her and the creature. The dark veins on her belly pulsed faster, and she felt something shift inside her, not the baby, but something deeper, something that had been sleeping in her cells her entire life. The creature smiled, revealing rows of teeth like broken glass. "You cannot run from what you are, Femme. You cannot run from family." The basement laboratory felt different now, charged with an electric tension that made Fem's skin crawl. The specimen containers lined the walls like silent witnesses, their contents floating in preservative solutions that glowed faintly under the overhead fluorescence. Leo pressed against her legs, his body rigid with alertness as they descended the wooden stairs. Fem's hands shook as she pulled up her research files on the computer terminal. The screen flickered to life, casting harsh blue light across her face. 23 years of xenobiological research, countless specimens catalogued and analyzed, but she knew exactly what she was looking for. The Kepler 442b expedition, the thing she'd tried so hard to forget. The first file opened with a timestamp from 2 decades ago. Young Fem stared back at her from the mission photo, standing beside the rest of the xenobiology team on the surface of that distant world. She remembered the excitement, the sense of discovery that had driven them to explore deeper into the planet's mysterious cave systems than protocol allowed. Leo whined softly, his ears flattened against his head. He could sense something was wrong, even if he couldn't understand the data scrolling across the screen. The mission reports detailed their findings: complex biological structures, evidence of advanced non-terrestrial life, and most importantly, the discovery of the reproductive chambers deep beneath the planet's surface. Fem's breath caught as she opened the next file. The eggs, dozens of them, arranged in perfect geometric patterns within the caverns. The official report stated they were inert, fossilized remnants of an extinct species. But Fem remembered the truth, the secret the team had agreed to bury. 3 of the eggs had shown signs of dormancy, not death, living organisms suspended in a state of metabolic hibernation. The investigation board had been thorough, ruthless in their questioning after the incident. Team leader Dr. Harrison's death had been ruled accidental, a result of equipment failure during the cave exploration. But Fem knew better. She'd seen what emerged from Harrison when the dormant organism inside him finally activated. The way his body had convulsed, split open like a ripe fruit, birthing something that defied every law of terrestrial biology. Her fingers trembled as she accessed the classified section of her personal files. The samples, against every regulation, every oath she'd taken as a scientist, she'd smuggled 3 microscopic egg fragments back to Earth. The official decontamination procedures would have destroyed them, and she'd convinced herself that studying them was worth the risk. The greatest discovery in human history, reduced to cellular samples hidden in her private laboratory. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her elevated stress levels. Fem placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the familiar flutter of movement within. She'd been so careful during her pregnancy, monitoring every aspect of her health, ensuring optimal conditions for fetal development. But what if something had been inside her all along, waiting for the right moment to activate? Leo's growl drew her attention back to the present. The dog was staring at something behind the specimen containers, his hackles raised. Fem followed his gaze and felt her blood turn to ice. One of the containment units was empty, its seal broken from the inside. The label read KB442ES001, the first egg sample she'd collected 23 years ago. She stumbled backward, knocking over a chair as the implications hit her. The samples weren't dormant. They'd been adapting, evolving, learning about their new environment, and somehow they'd found a way to breach containment. Her mind raced through the possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. How long had they been free? What had they been doing during that time? The basement's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Fem's breath came out in visible puffs as she frantically checked the other specimen containers. 2 more were empty, their contents vanished without a trace. Only the 4th container remained sealed, its occupant still suspended in the preservation fluid like a malevolent seed waiting to sprout. Leo barked once, sharp and urgent, then bolted toward the stairs. Fem heard what had spooked him, footsteps on the floor above, slow and deliberate. But that was impossible. She was alone in the cabin, had been alone for days since Marcus left for his research expedition, unless something was wearing Marcus's face, using his body as a vessel just like it had done to Dr. Harrison all those years ago. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the laboratory into absolute darkness. Fem fumbled for the emergency flashlight, her heart hammering against her ribs. When the beam cut through the blackness, she saw them, wet, glistening tracks leading from the empty containers to the basement stairs. Something had climbed out of those specimens and made its way upstairs into her home. Another kick from the baby, stronger this time, accompanied by a sharp pain that doubled her over. As she gasped for breath in the suffocating darkness, Fem realized with dawning horror that the invasion might have begun from within. The laboratory's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Fem pressed her back against the sealed blast door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Through the reinforced glass window, she could see the carnage beyond, overturned equipment, scattered papers floating in pools of something that definitely wasn't water, and the twisted remains of what had once been her colleagues. Leo whined softly beside her, his fur standing on end as he stared at the window. His ears were pinned back, and that familiar tremor ran through his body, the same warning he'd given her about the eggs all those weeks ago. She should have listened then. She should have burned everything and run. Her tablet chimed with an incoming transmission. Director Chen's face appeared on the screen, his usual composed expression cracking with barely contained panic. "Dr. Voss, what's your status? We've lost contact with Labs 7 through 12, and the biosecurity sensors are detecting massive organism proliferation in your sector." Fem adjusted the tablet so Chen couldn't see her swollen belly. At 8 months pregnant, there was no hiding her condition much longer, but she couldn't afford questions about the baby now, not when she was beginning to understand the horrifying truth about what was growing inside her. "The specimens have exceeded all containment protocols," she managed, trying to keep her voice steady. "The eggs we recovered from my cabin, they weren't dormant. They were incubating, waiting for the right conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Fem closed her eyes, remembering the moment 3 days ago when she'd first felt the baby move in an impossible way. Not kicking or rolling, but pulsing in rhythm with something else. Something that had called out across the laboratory complex like a signal. "Proximity to compatible genetic material," she whispered. Through the window, she watched as something that might have once been Dr. Martinez stumbled past. His body had been transformed, elongated and twisted, with additional limbs sprouting from his torso like malformed branches. But it was his eyes that made her stomach lurch. They'd turned the same opalescent black as the eggs, and when he turned toward the window, she saw recognition there. Intelligence that was decidedly not human. "Director, I need you to listen very carefully," Fem said, backing away from the window as Martinez began pressing his transformed hands against the glass. 15 years ago, the Kepler station incident, the official reports were falsified, weren't they?" Chen's face went ashen. "Fem, this isn't the time. My parents were on that station. I was born there, 3 weeks before the evacuation. What really happened?" Leo suddenly erupted into frantic barking, spinning in circles as he stared at Fem's belly. She looked down and gasped. Her shirt was moving, the fabric rippling as something beneath her skin responded to the proximity of the transformed creatures beyond the door. "The first contact," Chen finally admitted, his voice hollow. "We thought we could control it, study it, learn from it. The organism was unlike anything we'd ever encountered. It didn't just adapt to new environments, it adapted to new hosts. And once it established a genetic footprint in a bloodline, it could remain dormant for generations," Fem finished, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach, waiting for the right trigger. The blast door groaned ominously behind her. Through the window, she could see more transformed figures gathering, not just her former colleagues, but people she didn't recognize, security personnel, maintenance staff, anyone who'd been in the complex when the specimens broke containment. "There's something else," Chen continued, and she could hear the sound of alarms and shouting in the background of his transmission. The organism doesn't just transform its hosts, it uses them to prepare for the next phase of its life cycle, the pregnancy. Femme, it's not just your child anymore. Leo's barking intensified as the baby inside her pulsed again, stronger this time. She could feel something shifting, changing, as if responding to the proximity of its transformed siblings beyond the door. The pain was incredible, unlike anything she'd experienced in her previous pregnancies. "How long do I have?" she gasped. Based on the Kepler station data, once the transformation begins in utero, birth occurs within hours. But Femme, what emerges won't be. The transmission cut to static as the lights flickered and died. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, but the complex felt different now, quieter, as if something vast and patient was holding its breath. Through the window, the transformed figures had stopped their assault on the door. Instead, they stood in perfect formation, their black eyes all turned toward her, waiting. Leo pressed against her leg, whimpering softly, and she could feel his terror as clearly as her own. But beneath that fear was something else, a fierce, protective loyalty that had kept him by her side through everything. "Good boy," she whispered, reaching for the emergency weapon cache beside the door. "Just a little longer." The baby pulsed again, and this time she felt something that might have been its first breath. The laboratory's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red. As Femme pressed her back against the sealed door, Leo's warm body trembling beside her. The creature that had once been Dr. Elena Vasquez circled the room with predatory grace, its elongated limbs moving in ways that defied human anatomy. Where Elena's kind eyes had been, clusters of black, multifaceted organs tracked every movement. "You cannot hide from what you are," it spoke with Elena's voice, though the words seemed to come from multiple throats. "The memories are surfacing now, aren't they? Kepler 442b, the first contact protocols you helped develop." Femme's hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly as fragments of suppressed memories crashed through her consciousness like breaking glass. The red sand, the screaming, the way the indigenous creatures had looked at her with something approaching recognition before the orbital bombardment began. "I was following orders," she whispered. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they were inadequate. She remembered now the decision to classify an entire species as non-sentient because their neural patterns didn't match human baselines. Her recommendations had sealed their fate. Leo growled low, positioning himself between Femme and the thing that wore Elena's face. The creature tilted its head, studying the dog with newfound interest. "Such loyalty," it mused. "Your companion sees clearly. He knows what grows within you isn't entirely human anymore." The creature's form shimmered, and for a moment Elena's original features flickered through like a bad transmission. "We've been preparing it, you see. Your child will be our bridge between worlds." Horror flooded through Femme as she felt movement in her womb. Not the gentle kicks she'd grown accustomed to, but something urgent and deliberate. A rhythmic tapping against her ribs like Morse code. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Her child was trying to communicate. "The integration began weeks ago," the creature continued, moving closer with fluid, inhuman steps. "Every meal you've consumed from the local ecosystem, every breath of spore-laden air. The process is nearly complete." Femme's scientific mind raced even as terror threatened to overwhelm her. The pregnancy symptoms that had seemed so normal, the unusual cravings, the enhanced senses, the way her body temperature had run consistently higher than normal. It hadn't been pregnancy at all, it had been colonization. "But there's something you didn't account for," she said, her voice steadying as understanding crystallized. "My child isn't just a hybrid. It's fighting back." The tapping in her abdomen intensified, and suddenly she could feel something else, a presence, alien but unmistakably protective. Her unborn child had been exposed to the colonization process, but instead of being consumed by it, it had learned to communicate with the entities. It was serving as a translator, showing them something the collective consciousness hadn't expected to see. Human guilt, remorse, the capacity for growth and change. The creature paused, its multiple eyes focusing intently on Fem's belly. That's impossible. We've studied your species extensively. You're driven by consumption and expansion. You destroy what you cannot control. Some of us, Fem admitted, tears streaming down her face as more memories surfaced. The children on Kepler-4, 42b, who had approached the human settlement with gifts, crystalline structures that sang with harmonious frequencies, the way they had tried to share their art, their culture, their very essence before the fear and misunderstanding had turned to violence. Leo whined softly, pressing closer to her leg. His presence grounded her, reminded her that love and loyalty could exist alongside terrible mistakes, that redemption might still be possible. "My child is showing you something, isn't it?" she said. "It's showing you that we're capable of more than destruction." The creature's form began to shift and blur, as if receiving conflicting signals. Other entities emerged from the shadows, the missing researchers, their bodies transformed but their expressions uncertain. Through her developing connection with her child, Fem could sense the collective consciousness wavering. They had expected humans to be a virus requiring elimination or assimilation. They hadn't anticipated finding genuine remorse or the possibility of genuine change. "The child offers a third option," Fem continued, her voice growing stronger. "Not domination by either species. Partnership. The kind Kepler 442b could have been if we hadn't been so afraid of what we didn't understand." The Elena creature stepped back, its multiple eyes widening. "You would sacrifice your own species' dominance?" "I would sacrifice my species' worst impulses to save its best ones," Fem replied. "And I think you'll find that desire runs deeper than you imagined. We're not all the same, just as I imagine your collective isn't as unified as you believed." The laboratory fell silent except for the hum of emergency power and Leo's steady breathing. In her womb, her child's tapping shifted to a new pattern, longer, more complex, like a conversation between old friends. Around them, the transformed researchers began to flicker between their human and alien forms, as if caught between two possibilities for the future. The basement walls pulsed with an organic rhythm that matched Fem's thundering heartbeat. The creatures that had emerged from the eggs weren't just alien, they were disturbingly familiar. Their elongated skulls bore the same cranial ridges she'd sketched in her research journals years ago, the same bioluminescent patterns that had haunted her dreams since the Kepler mission. Leo pressed against her leg, his growl a constant vibration through her bones. The dog's hackles stood rigid as steel wire, his amber eyes tracking the three beings that circled them in the cramped space. They moved with predatory grace, their chitinous limbs clicking against the concrete floor in a syncopated rhythm that made Fem's skin crawl. "I know what you are," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to the tension flooding her system. "You're from Kepler 442b, but that's impossible. The mission failed. The colony ship never made it back." The largest creature tilted its head, studying her with multifaceted eyes that shifted color from deep purple to electric blue. When it spoke, the words formed in her mind rather than her ears, a telepathic invasion that left her gasping. Not failed, evolved. The voice carried with it a cascade of images, the Kepler colony ship drifting in space, its hull breached and dark, bodies floating in the void, their faces twisted in expressions of terror and pain. But some of the colonists weren't dead. They were changing, their human forms melting and reshaping into something new, something that could survive in the vacuum between stars. "The eggs," Fem breathed, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "You didn't just find Earth randomly. You followed the genetic trail back. The colonists who were transformed, their DNA still carried Earth markers." "Your DNA," the creature corrected, moving closer. "You were there, Dr. Fem, in the beginning. Your research, your samples, your genetic material in our databanks." The memory hit her like a physical blow. 15 years ago, fresh out of graduate school, she'd contributed biological samples to the Kepler mission's genetic diversity project. Every colonist had provided DNA for the seed banks, insurance against genetic bottlenecks in humanity's first interstellar colony. She'd been so proud to be part of history's greatest adventure. Leo's growl intensified, and he stepped forward, placing himself between Femme and the advancing creatures. His loyalty was absolute, even in the face of incomprehensible danger. The smallest of the three beings, no larger than a house cat but infinitely more menacing, hissed at the dog with a sound like escaping steam. "What do you want?" Femme demanded, backing toward the stairs. Each step sent sharp pains through her lower back, and she felt moisture between her legs that might have been amniotic fluid. The stress was triggering premature labor. "Why come to my cabin? Why now?" "The child," came the response. And this time, all three creatures spoke in unison, their mental voices creating a harmony that made her teeth ache. New genetics, human hybrid potential. The next phase of evolution. The largest creature extended one elongated finger toward her belly, and Femme saw that its skin wasn't just chitinous. It had an almost crystalline quality, refracting light in impossible ways. Where human DNA had once coded for soft flesh and vulnerable bones, these beings had developed something far more adaptable. "You want my baby?" It wasn't a question. The certainty settled in her chest like a stone. "You're looking for genetic compatibility, a bridge between your species and humanity. Not take, transform, improve. Your offspring will survive where pure humans cannot." Another contraction ripped through her, stronger this time, and Femme doubled over with a cry of pain. Leo whined and pressed closer, his warm bulk offering what comfort he could. The creatures watched with clinical interest, their heads cocking in unison like a trio of predatory birds. Through the haze of pain, Femme's scientific mind continued working. These beings weren't evil in any traditional sense. They were following their evolutionary imperative, seeking to adapt and survive. But their vision of survival meant the end of human individuality, the dissolution of everything that made her species unique. "There has to be another way," she gasped between contractions. "Cooperation instead of assimilation. Coexistence." The creatures exchanged what might have been glances, though with their alien features it was impossible to be certain. The middle one stepped forward, its movements flowing like liquid mercury. "You speak of coexistence, yet your species destroys its own world, wars amongst itself, fears what is different. We offer transcendence." "And I'm offering choice," Femme shot back, forcing herself to stand straight despite the pain. "My child will choose their own path." The largest creature's eyes flared brighter, and Femme felt a pressure in her skull like the onset of a migraine. Around them, the basement walls seemed to pulse faster, as if the building itself had become part of some vast organism. The final confrontation was beginning, and she could feel her strength ebbing with each passing moment. The creature's death throes sent shockwaves through the cabin's broken structure, its alien scream echoing into the mountain's silence before cutting off abruptly. Femme pressed her back against the wall, Leo trembling beside her, both watching as the twisted form finally went still. Purple ichor pooled beneath it, steaming against the wooden floor. Her hands found her swollen belly, feeling for movement. A gentle kick answered, and relief flooded through her so intensely she nearly collapsed. The baby was alive, still safe. But as the adrenaline began to fade, questions crashed over her like a tide. The destroyed eggs, the creature's final words about the harvest, and most disturbing of all, how it had seemed to know things about her that she'd never told anyone. The connection it claimed between her unborn child and whatever nightmare had spawned these things. Leo whined softly, nosing at something near the creature's remains. Femme followed his gaze and saw it, a small metallic device that had fallen from the creature's body. No bigger than her thumb, it pulsed with the same ethereal light that had emanated from the eggs. Against every instinct screaming at her to flee, she picked it up. The moment her fingers touched its surface, images flooded her mind. She saw herself as a child, walking through tall grass under an alien sky. Twin moons hung overhead, casting everything in silver light. Her parents were there, but they looked different. Their eyes held the same otherworldly gleam she'd seen in the creature's gaze. They were speaking to her in a language that wasn't quite human, telling her about a purpose she was meant to fulfill. The vision shifted. She was older now, perhaps 16, standing in a laboratory that defied earthly architecture. The walls seemed to breathe, organic and technological, merged into something impossible. Scientists worked at stations that grew from the floor like living trees, and in the center of it all sat an enormous egg, its surface swirling with galaxies of light. The prototype, her vision father was saying. When you're ready, when you carry new life, it will awaken the others, the next phase of human evolution. The images fractured, showing her fragments of a life she'd somehow forgotten. Her real parents, not the couple who'd raised her on Earth. A childhood spent preparing for this moment. Genetic modifications so subtle they'd never shown up on any medical scan, designed to make her the perfect vessel for something that wasn't entirely human. She dropped the device, gasping. Leo immediately moved between her and the alien technology, hackles raised, but the damage was done. The memories were flooding back now, 27 years of buried truth clawing its way to the surface. Her pregnancy wasn't an accident. The isolated cabin, her research into xenobiology, even meeting David, it had all been orchestrated. She was a sleeper agent in her own life, programmed to fulfill a purpose she'd never consciously agreed to. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Fem felt something that might have been terror or wonder. Was the child even human? Or was it something else, something that would bridge the gap between worlds? She thought of David, probably still at the university, completely unaware that his child might be the key to an alien invasion. The normalcy of their relationship, the gentle way he'd rubbed her feet when they swelled, how he'd spent hours researching baby names, it all felt like a cruel joke now. But as she stood there in the ruins of her cabin, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, Fem realized something that surprised her. It didn't matter. Whatever the child was, whatever purpose it had been designed to fulfill, it was still hers. She had carried it, felt it grow, dreamed of holding it in her arms. No alien agenda could change that fundamental connection. Leo barked once, sharp and urgent. Through the broken windows, she could see lights moving through the forest, not the natural glow of the eggs, but the harsh beams of flashlights. Search teams, probably sent when she'd missed her scheduled check-in. She had minutes to decide. She could tell them everything, hand over the alien device, let scientists and government officials take control. The baby would become a specimen, studied and tested, and ultimately used as a weapon in whatever cosmic war had sent these creatures to Earth. Or she could run. Fem looked down at Leo, who tilted his head as if asking what she needed him to do. This dog who had sensed the danger before she had, who had fought beside her against something from beyond the stars. Whatever choice she made, she knew he would follow. The voices were getting closer now, calling her name through the darkness. Fem slipped the alien device into her pocket and moved toward the cabin's back door. She had a truck hidden in the old mining trail, supplies cached for emergencies. David would understand eventually, or maybe he wouldn't, but that was a bridge she'd cross when she came to it. Right now, she had to protect her child. Human, alien, or something altogether new. The harvest these creatures spoke of would have to find another way. She opened the door and stepped into the mountain darkness, Leo at her side, carrying the future in her womb.